Good evening, and welcome to podcast 3, which is going to be a continuation of our discussion of blacks in the Bible. I'm your host, Dr. Mike, and and I'm grateful that you turned into From the Biblical Files of Dr. Mike. Our biblical focus today is going to be on Hagar and her relationship with Abraham. And we will start by mentioning that the bulk of our information is going to come from the book of Genesis, and we'll give you scriptures as we go along. Now, based on the scripture itself, Hagar is identified as an Egyptian slave. Therefore, she was descended from Ham in the ancient Hebrew and accustomed to the language of the Akkadians, the Sumerians, um, who were also descended from Ham. Thus, she's given a specific geographical region as well as a particular historical period. Now, just a quick review. We've already talked about Genesis 10, where the descendants of Ham were located in northern Africa, Central Africa, and in parts of southern Asia. In Psalms 105, verse 23, there's a mention of the land of Ham in Egypt. And in Psalm 78, verse 51, there's a connection to, quote, the tents of Ham with Egypt. Now, we mentioned last time in Genesis 10, Nimrod, who was the son of Cush, which means black, founded a civilization known as Mesopotamia. Now, in Genesis 11, we find Abraham, who was from the land of Ur of the Chaldees, a land whose earliest inhabitants it did include blacks. The people of that region where Abraham came from can be proven historically and archaeologically to have been intermixed racially. Genesis 14 tells us how Abraham experiences the land of Canaan and Egypt, wherein he brought his wife and his family there because of the famine. So both archaeological evidence and the account in First Chronicles 4 tells us that the land of Canaan was inhabited by the descendants of Ham, and we're talking about the relatives of Hagar. Yeah, question is, well, is Hagar a black woman? Well, as we said earlier, race is not mentioned or a meaningful term for the biblical period. Hagar's identity is simply given as an Egyptian woman who who some people or some interpreters believe to have been an African, and her skin is dark. But if you notice any of the paintings, starting at the 18th, 19th century, her skin is not dark. So some readers see in this the relationship between Sarah and for our purposes today, we're going to use Sarah and Abraham. That relationship between Sarah and Hagar in this story to be that of the white female oppressor and the black slave woman. And this is done particularly by Friar Kinskey, who's recently passed away, but her work is phenomenal. Now, what are the key themes in this story of Abraham and Hagar? Well, it's a complex story to begin with, and there are themes that resonate throughout the scripture, beginning with God's faithfulness to his promises. So, despite our human failings and doubt, God remained faithful to fulfill his covenant with Abraham. Isaac's miraculous birth demonstrated God's faithfulness. Second thing, God's providence for all. Through the covenant continued through Isaac, God cared for Hagar and Ishmael, promising to make Ishmael a great nation. And you'll hear me repeat that several times today. Theme 3, God hears the oppressed. When Hagar cried out in oppression, God heard her affliction. And those who face oppression, God is there who is not judging, but he is there to render aid. Thing 4. There's a complex family dynamics going on here. The surrogate mother custom created complex relationships within the family, which resulted in discord, jealousy, and mistreatment. Human sin tainted the family in this story. Let's go to the next thing: promise and peril in offspring. Though Abraham was blessed with two sons, rivalry between them carried grave implications. Offsprings bring both joy and testing. The story powerfully illuminates human relationships under divine sovereignty. Despite the messiness, and I will use the word messiness here for lack of a better word, of family dynamics, God advances his redemptive plan. Although I will mention it maybe once or twice later, the redemptive plan is at the core that we have here. But what is the setting for this particular story? There was a famine in the land, so Abraham went down to Egypt, and that's in Genesis 12 and 10. Well, nowhere does it indicate that God told him to go to Canaan and to go to Egypt. But when the famine occurred, that's where he headed with his wife and those who were with him. You remember the story of Lot. Um, this was a turn of events that changed the world forever. Now, a second bad decision is made when Abraham gives his wife Sarah to Pharaoh, claiming her to be his sister out of fear for his own life. And in all fairness to Abraham, there was no divorce in Egypt, only death. Um, he was in enemy territory, a man who could be killed for his wife, and we are told that Sarah was a very beautiful woman, even though she was 65 years old at this time. Now, Pharaoh does indeed find out that this is Abraham's wife, and he gives him a reward, or he gives him gifts. I love this story, and you have to go sometimes away from our Bible over to the Middle Eastern to get the fact that Pharaoh's companions had taken Sarah away from Abraham and taken her to the palace, and he placed her in the harem, his harem, and he planned to make her his wife. Now, it doesn't really get into details, but when he decided to execute this event, he was struck still, according to one of the legends, and one of the others say that he was overtaken by balls. So Sarah was praying at the time, and so was Abraham, according to that legend. And he asked her what was going on, and he understood that her prayer to this invisible God um, was at the core of it. So, with that in mind, he gave and he took to Abraham male and female donkeys, male and female camels, male and female slaves, and other gifts, because he had wrongly taken Sarah into his household. This is thought to be how Abraham and Sarah acquired Hagar, as she was most likely one of the female slaves. Now, I have to step aside again and say there is another version which says that, well, Hagar was the Pharaoh's daughter of one of his concubines, but um, he was impressed by Sarah's qualities, and he stated that it would be better for her to go with Sarah than it would be to stay there and be a princess in one of the other kingdoms. It doesn't talk too much about whether or not he was converted or anything, but it was one of those let your light shine kind of moments. But she was given away, and she was given away to strangers. Uh, the fact that she was given away as a slave was not strange, but the fact that it was a stranger whose customs and culture she did not know. Now, coming from Egypt, she would have been a person who worship the gods of the sun, and it would have been a polytheistic pantheon. There were many gods. So she's going into a household where that's not the case. So approximately 10 years after being back in the land promised to Abraham once again, this couple comes up with yet another bad idea without consulting God. Now, Sarah is actually the scheme maker this time, but Abraham goes along to get along, apparently. During the famine in Canaan, Sarah and Abraham, we know their names were changed, and their household, fled there. It is there. We're looking now at Genesis 15, verse 4, um, where this is perhaps where she joined his household. So in Genesis 15:4, God promised Abraham, your very own son shall be your heir. However, Sarah remained barren and had not borne him any children. So after Abraham had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarah and Abraham took upon themselves to solve the problem. So Sarah, the wife, gave unto Abraham Hagar, the Egyptian servant, so that she could become his wife, and I'm using quotes here. So in Genesis 16, we see, in verse 3, we see this. And I want you to notice she gave. And in some of the other translations, it just says that she looked around her and she saw the customs of the people. And this is one of those things, one of the situations where you have the Israelites who are looking and seeing and pulling conclusions that are not going to work for them. So the practice of having a concubine bear children on behalf of a barren wife was commonly accepted at the time and is evidenced in the old Assyrian marriage contracts, the Code of Hammurabi, and the Ninzu tablet. So Sarah revealed her reason when she said, behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant. Go into my servant. Notice how it's being put. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. Genesis 16, verse 2. Sarah did not believe that God would be fruitful to his, and be faithful to his promise. So she decided that she would just do this herself. Well, Sarah viewed Hagar simply as a useful pawn in her plan. Hagar conceived, and this is in Genesis 16, chapter 4 verse, and she looked with contempt upon her mistress. This contempt led Sarah to mistreat and abuse Hagar. So Hagar fled to the wilderness. And we're going to stop right there. We're going to take a deeper look at what we have here. Now we got to remember at this point, Abraham is now a rich man because of all the things that he's received, all of the quote unquote gifts that he's received, and that includes Hagar. But he's spending his time being a minister, and I apologize for the ringing of the phone. He's spending his time in being a minister, talking about this God of his who's known as Yahweh, and that he is talking about everything at this point on a spiritual realm. And this is the pre-Sinai time. So the setting that we're looking at, we're still in a desert, but we are in a community. Now, for those of us who sometimes wonder if the Holy Scriptures have anything to do with our lives, what we have to do is to look at this story. God had promised an old man that he would have an heir. And the old man is thinking, well, my wife is approximately 10 years younger than I am, but she's an old woman and she is barren. So we are looking at a situation that's somewhat like one of the nighttime dramas or the soap operas that still exist in the day. Now, what we have here, we won't talk too much about the conflict between Abraham's nephew Lot and himself, but we will talk about this journey, and we have to remember, um, we have to remember as we go through that they are on a journey too. They have a point of arrival because there's a covenant out there that does exist, and we're going to see that we're going to get a covenant within a covenant, a promise within a promise. So we go through that. And the characters, the people that we'll be talking about, well, we have Yahweh God, we have Abraham or Abram, we have Sarah or Sarai, we have Hagar as well as Keturah, well, Hagar slash Keturah. We have the Egyptian Pharaoh who is unnamed. We have the son yet to be born, Ishmael. Um, be born to Hagar, and we have the son Isaac to be born to Sarah, and we have two angels who are very important, whose encounter in the desert makes it very part of the whole story to be fulfilled. Our conflict issues: man versus the supernatural, or man versus God, man versus man, and most importantly, man versus something within herself, or woman versus something within herself. We're focusing here not on Sarah. Most of the writings have been done on Sarah. We want to focus on Hagar. So what we have is the covenant, and then we have the broad topics. We have the effect of a divine encounter, not one time, but two times, three times, or four times, because we have God's encounter with Abraham, the talking to Abraham, because God had chosen him. We have the angels or the heavenly beings who speak to Hagar in the desert. We have the issue of to trust God or to trust yourself. That is an overriding topic throughout. And we have the beautiful story, sad as it is, the story of going from a slave to becoming the mother of a nation. Nothing's impossible for God. So Hagar becomes the foundation of the Arab nation. And Hagar represents all the women in the Bible who are excluded or despised. And for those of you who are gonna, say, okay, what were you saying about being barren and using a concubine? Well, an ancient marriage arrangement was an oral thing that often stipulated that if a wife was barren, she must provide a handmaiden for her husband. And I mentioned earlier, it's the Code of Hammurabi, and it's paragraphs 144 and 145 and the adoption contract Anuze, as well as the, um, the 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 ceremony itself, or you may not think of it as a ceremony, but the agreement. The naming of the handmaid given to the bride by her father is such in such cases was evident related to this practice. So we won't go deep in that. We just know that it did exist, but it wasn't one that comes from God. That's not what God said when He left Eve and Adam out of the Garden of Eden. He said, "Go forth and multiply," and He assumes. And this is the problem here when we talk about Abraham making a mistake. He he and Sarah had decided, okay, we're old, we're not going to have children. And Abraham, even in one of his conversations with God, he says, well, I guess my slave will be my heir. And God has said to him, no, Sarah will be the one who gives you a child in the flesh, a child in the spirit. Now, what's Hagar's story in the Bible? Well, again, we know she was a slave. That's starting Genesis 16, verse 1. She had borne him, Sarah had borne him no children, but she decided, based on what we just said, the concubine code, as it's sometimes known, that she would use Hagar. So Hagar was a surrogate, which is a nice word for it now, for Abraham's promised son because Sarah could not have one. And she blamed everybody. I found that interesting. You say God had not, had looked up, he had pleasure. So it's interesting the way she puts it. So after Abraham had been living in Canaan 10 years, his wife took her slave, Hagar, and gave her to the husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. We're again looking in chapter 16 of Genesis, verses 3 and 4. This is Hagar's story in the Bible. Thus, Hagar became the mother of Ishmael and thereby giving Abraham a son. And one of the interesting things that happened there is when she's out in the desert with the angels, she says that you will call him Ishmael. But Abraham named the child Ishmael. So it's one of those links that's interesting to look at as you go through it. Another aspect of her life is that Hagar was sent away by Sarah into the desert. Your slave is in your hands. That's what Abraham had said when Sarah went to him complaining about the attitude that Hagar had. Uh, and Abraham's response, which I find somewhat passive, do with her whatever you think. Then Sarah mistreated Hagar, so she ran away. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was at that spring there beside the road in Genesis chapter 16, verses 6 and 7, that has become part of the pilgrimage of those who believe in that Muslim religion. Hagar was promised that she would be the mother of a great nation, paralleling God's promise to Abraham. This is what we meant by the covenant within the covenant, the promise within the promise. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. Genesis 16, verse 10. So she was sent away again by Sarah. Early that morning, this is the second Exodus, Abraham took some food and the skin of water and he gave it to Hagar and he set the boy on the shoulder and he sent them off. He sent them off into the desert. And you know that at this point, Hagar is going to be wandering in the desert. But it becomes important. God provided for her and her son. They settled in the wilderness. So God was with the boy, and we'll talk about God's response to his crying as he grew up. And he lived in the desert and became a great archer with a bow. We've gone all the way to Genesis 21, verse 20. Now, Hagar found an Egyptian wife for Ishmael. While he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got him a wife from Egypt, which was her home country. Now, if you want to look at Hagar in Bible verses, you'll find that her story spans both the Old Testament and the New Testament. But if you'd like to read it through the verses, here are some that you should read. Genesis 16, verses 1 through 16, Genesis 21, verses 8 through 21, Genesis 25, verse 12, and Galatians, we'll move into the New Testament, chapter 4, verse 24 and 25. So, whether she was a princess or a slave, she had some divine encounters. She was a gift to Sarah. She was the mother of a son who was going to be a prince in his own right. And if we believe the Middle Eastern version of the story, Pharaoh wanted Sarah to mentor his quote unquote daughter. Now, and we also have to infer that it was okay for Hagar having to live with Abraham and Sarah that she observed and converted to Judaism, and therefore she could have married Abraham. Interesting note here. Then the word concubine, we can use it as a concubine, or we can use it as a lesser wife or a secondary wife. And in most cases, when I think of Hagar, I think of her as a secondary wife because that's in essence what she was. She wasn't a wound on legs, or she wasn't just some body to serve as a vessel to a child who was going to be born. Now, she did wear a variety of hats, and she was, the word Hagar means outsider. She was a foreigner. She became a foreigner. Well, that's what she was, and because she was not Jewish like Sarah and Abraham. So, what are the characteristics of Hagar in the Bible? Well, like any human being, Hagar had many strengths and weaknesses. So let's just look at them. Hagar was a proud woman, um, a servant girl, a slave, but she became pregnant with Abraham's son, and she went from being a very humble person to being conceited. Now, those who tell the story from Sarah's point of view, they make Hagar the villain. But we're going to look at it a little differently today. I'm not saying she's perfect, but she's going to they make Hagar the villain on behalf and on the belief that God showed favor to women by giving them children. It is Sarah who says, but he showed me this favor by preventing me from having a child. So Hagar basically developed a problem with pride because she thought she had God's favor and Sarah didn't. And the fact that her status from slave would be elevated to secondary wife or lesser wife in the community um, would would enhance her too. So technically, that's what she was. You can call her a concubine or lesser wife or secondary wife. But she was never going to be equal to Sarah, who was the first wife. So Hagar's son would be an heir to Abraham's wealth. That is what she thought. And you'll hear this discussion in here about the inheritance, how Sarah felt about his inheritance, Abraham's inheritance, and basically hers too, because she was the one in the harem with the Egyptian Pharaoh, but she had no son of her own, no heir to pass on, and God had made a promise. So rather than staying with her faith, standing on her faith, she goes to find a solution herself. So let's go through and think about her having pride. Now, another characteristic that Hagar possessed um, would be that Hagar was courageous and she was strong. She didn't have an easy life of it. Um, when she ran away from Sarah, she tried to go back to Egypt, it is presumed, even though she's pregnant, even though she's crossing the desert, even though she's ill prepared. Remember, on this first exodus out of the community, she had nothing. She was just tired of being abused and treated badly by Sarah, so she ran. So even in her state, she thought she could trek across the desert, not even realizing that she could die there. So, and the two things she didn't have a lot of, she had no water and she had no food. But if God had not met her beside the stream, she would have made it back, perhaps, according to some scholars. But what it does reveal is that she was a brave woman who tried on her own. So she sort of, in a way, lacking in inner strength, but at the same time getting some. So she braved death to see if she could reclaim her freedom and her peace. So characteristic 2. So Hagar was teachable, which is characteristic 3. Although she had a pride problem, Hagar was not beyond saving. So God saw this. Hagar knew that she had provoked Sarah. She was aware that she had done that. She knew that the position she was in was a direct result of decisions that she had made. And I want to add a codicil here. She had made, but she had no control over it. She knew she had to accept part of the blame. And we'll back up here where we have to, when we make a mistake, we must acknowledge it. So she knew those things. But what we have here is that Hagar could have chosen to keep moving towards Egypt. She could have told the angel who was sent that she was not interested in going back, but she didn't. She did not do that. She chose to be obedient to God's direction. She submitted herself to his sovereignty. Now, how do you say, okay, I just said she's from a polytheistic country, but having been in the household, she knew the miracles, she knew the teachings. So she decided, and here is this person, this heavenly being coming to her in really a time of need. So her pride melted away and it was replaced with humility, which is something that is a positive characteristic. So Hagar had strong faith. So based on her background, okay, we've talked about that. She worshiped the idols at the beginning, but then she came to believe in God. So when Jesus showed up to talk to her, she knew exactly what was going on, and she followed his direction. Not only was she going to live, but she was going to experience the abundance that Abraham was blessed with. So when she decided to be obedient and return home, she did not believe the words of her idols, but she believed the words of God Himself. So we're moving as we go on into that. So as a slave surrogate, and I hesitate to use the word surrogate because it sounds nice, but in this case, no one asked her if she wanted to do this, if she wanted to be in fact, many of the scholars refer to her as an involuntary surrogate. But she would have this child who would really be considered Sarah's child if you go back and look at Genesis 16 and 3. And the the child would then be part of Abraham's family, would be his heir. So we have this and we have to look at it and we say to ourselves, okay, could we live with this? Well, all of the stories in the Bible have an application for us. And as we go through, you'll see it more and more. One of the things I did notice here is that Sarah and Abraham actually never used Hagar's name. Like I said, it means foreigner or outcast. But if you remember when you read that piece about the heavenly angel appearing, he called her name. He actually called her, she just never, she's less than a person. She's, as so many people see servants, there to serve only, an inferior person. So in Genesis 4, we take a look at, in Genesis 6, where Sarah, quote unquote, deals with her harshly, because all of a sudden, you gotta remember, here is, this isn't Sarah's story, but we have to mention it. Here is a woman who is who is the wife of the chieftain, the wife leader of the chieftain, who has no children at all. But at that point, it could possibly be those members of the community could say, well, it's not her fault. It could be Abraham's fault. But when Hagar gets pregnant, guess what? It is no longer a possibility that it is his fault. It becomes Sarah's fault that she doesn't have children at this point. So we have to look at what's going on, and we see this multi-generational situation that's going to ensue as we go through. We've talked about the fact that, and I have to smile as I do this because we are basically going to talk about Abraham sort of trying to make a deal with God, you know. Uh, this is in Genesis, and it's not talked about a whole lot, where he's talking about that, well, his slave could be his heir and everything, you know. Um, therefore we can fulfill the covenant, and God is rejecting his argument. It's a pretty sound argument, but it wasn't what God had decreed. He had not. You have to trust God. It's not a matter of trusting yourself. And of all the people, Abraham should have been the one, to have trusted him. But we find that even Abraham was a little on the shifty side. So, uh, so when the angel comes, and I'm going back to that, the angel of the Lord is talking to her. So the Lord is showing affection to Hagar, and I love the fact that after she bears the son and she's put out because Sarah sees Ishmael mocking, and it doesn't matter what translation you use, Mocking, um, Isaac on his day of weaning, on the feast that's being held for him, and she's put out again. And here we understand that um, I don't want to say he's being passive. We find that Abraham is just at this point, cast out the slave woman with her son, you know, for the son of this slave woman will not inherit along with my son Isaac. You know, um, it's a matter that's distressing Abraham, but there's nothing said. But he does speak with God, and God tells him to do what Sarah has suggested to do. And this is again where he gives him the meager provisions, and they're off again. And when I say meager, it wasn't enough. The water ran out, and Hagar is out in the desert, and Ishmael is crying out in a voice that God heard. God heard what he had to say. So if we take a look at what the women of this period, uh, we're actually before Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and these women are basically protected or following the clay tablets, of the code of Hammurabi, and it's very interesting to note that there were protections given to them under this law. The protected right of women in marriage, protect women against rape, define punishment for adultery, define the just treatment of women who were slaves, which was Hagar, regulate the behavior of women who served in the temple, state conditions for divorce. Okay? Now, someone said, well, why didn't Sarah just get rid of her rather than, casting her out? She couldn't. She couldn't kill her because the slave could not be dealt with in a summary fashion. Regardless of what you've seen in the film, it didn't happen that way. Like I said, these laws were there to protect the slave. So Sarah could not kill her, even if she'd wish. She had to resort to other methods, which was a banishment. That's a nice way to put it. She had to resort to the banishment according to the law. And that banishment is going to lead to um, two families, basically, and three religions. So it's important that we look at it that way, and we go through it. Now, I meant to say at the very beginning, I want to thank all of the theologians, seminarians, rabbis, because this is an eclectic um, group of information. Those who are just bloggers and persons who are, I like to call them laity who study. That's me. We like to study the Bible and go through it. So it's important that we do that. So we're getting down to the fact that, again, this isn't Sarah's story, but we are going to have to talk about the death of Sarah. Um, and Isaac's reaction to it. And this is going to be sort of extra biblical. We'll run to the Torah just for a moment and we'll take a look at that. When Sarah died, um, Isaac went back, because we got to remember Hagar, according to tradition, was out of the community, but not that far. So when he died, the first thing that he did, Isaac did, um, he went back to the handmaid, who was the one who had basically raised him. Um, uh, and it's a physical loss that he has, and it's the heartbreak that is so shattering. And he goes where he thinks he can find comfort and peace. Now that's extra biblical. I like to say when I'm stepping outside of the biblical, when I say biblical, the Bible. But if you recall from earlier in Genesis, um, the well that sprang up there, again, is treated as a very spiritual symbol for those who are of the Muslim faith. Now, though there are those who say, well, Hagar and Sarah couldn't have been bad sister wives, another term I'm really not comfortable using, but because that becomes sort of a masculine thing, you can have as many wives as whatever, but we do see sort of terrible events that occurred. And we also see at the same time children who are not part of a body, but are of a body. And this is where we bring in Keturah. So after Sarah died, according to some legend, um, Isaac actually goes and he finds her because she's she's in a community outside the wilderness where her son has grown up, and she has found him a wife, and he has sons. He has 12 sons, and those sons become princes within the Muslim religion. But he brings Keturah back to Abraham, who is, you remember now, he's already aged. And her name becomes Keturah because of quote unquote how sweet she had been, how sweet a life she had lived after the banishment. She never remarried. She just raised Ishmael, and that she never entertained any idea. She remained faithful to him. And her given name is finally recorded, which is Keturah, which is the name. Hagar meaning, foreigner, outside, but the name she was given during her time with the Pharaoh was Keturah. Um, she had sons with Abraham, and when Abraham died, according to this story, um, both Isaac and Ishmael were there to take care of that. Now, these are lessons from the Torah, but we we can go back into Genesis, and we can continue to discuss Hagar as a slave. Now, there's this overriding picture that many African American women are very taken with the story, and you can actually see it if you're taking a look at the antebellum South period and even post antebellum life. Here you have um, sort of an unwritten law. Masters can do whatever with the slaves, and they did. There was a lot of abuse, both from women as well as from men. Um, and we have to say that as we go through, we find, that when persons are abused, you're going to find some retribution that comes. And God was aware of what was going on, and He does it. So what happens to her? We're still in the Keturah mode, okay? So Hagar experiences all of this stuff. And when I say stuff, the messiness, but God saw her in 5 ways. First, he saw her faults. So Hagar was bitter at one point, and her heart was hardened to watch Sarah. So he saw that, and he looked and he changed it. Secondly, God saw Hagar's frustrations. with being powerless and being abused. And thirdly, God saw Hagar's family, that she would have a son who would father a great nation. And another little interesting point here is that I love that in the part where she's going to have the son, that he would not have the same life that she had. Remember, he said that he would be as a wild ass, um, and he wouldn't be really friendly and lovable to anyone, but he would always be in opposition with them. But she would have a family, and there would be no bondage for her son. And thirdly, he saw that she was fearful, and that drove her to run away. Um, and finally, he saw her future. And we're going back to the fact that she eventually came into what is called a godly legacy. So I see God here as painting Hagar with a brush, a beautiful canvas, and he's painting this brush on it. And on each of her trials and tribulations becomes a color or a texture. And with it, we're going to have a painting that's going to verify that she's going to bear this child and that he's going to be part of a plan, a great plan. And most importantly, he's going to be part of a great blessing. And then we're going to have the emotional, there'll be pieces on there that will be emotionally abusive. There'll be pieces on there where she will be spiritually wounded and she's going to be abandoned. And we'll be able to see that. But this kind of situation brings all that out. Um, there'll be a piece on this canvas that says about all the rejection that women of Hagar's stature experiences. So the emotional abuse, the abandonment, the rejection, they all become part of her life. But her story gives us hope as we go through. There was no one that she could count on, and she had been abandoned. And I really hate to think about it this way, this emotional abandonment. She had been abandoned by Pharaoh, who gave her to Abraham. She had been abandoned by Sarah, who gave her up to Abraham as a wife. She had been abandoned when the conflict came up with Sarah. She became pregnant, and guess what? Abraham, who should have been her protector, abandoned her also. So she suffers a great deal from abandonment, and she's spiritually wounded. We don't mind talking about this, but at this time, we only know one thing about the family, and that is that um, Abraham and Sarah were persons who were supposed to be model persons in the community, and they were part of her extended family, if you want to think of it that way. But she's spiritually wounded by seeing and being the result of some of the things that they did. So she learned about God from Abraham and Sarah. But you have people who are speaking the word, but they're not living the faith. So it's important that we live that life we sing about. It's very important that we do that. She's deeply loved. And the love came from God. So God finds lost people. He does that and he takes care of them. And God hears suffering people. He sent an angel on 2 occasions. Well, on that, I love that one in there where the angel turned out to be God and she knows this God. And she's one of the one of the only persons in the Bible who actually gives God a name. We're talking about Hagar. God sees all people, not just the good or the faithful or whatever. He sees us all, and His grace is sufficient. One of the things I remember that's going through here, my dad used to sing the song, Grace, His grace, is sufficient. And as a kid, I didn't understand it, but as I go through and read the story of Hagar and Abraham, I understand the story. She was obedient to God, which meant living in a very difficult situation continuously. But when God commanded her to return and to apologize and to stay there and to let her know what was going to come for her. So it ends with a very positive situation, although it's not positive all the way through. The message is not come to Jesus and you will live happily ever after. The message is my grace is sufficient for you. And that's in Corinthians 2, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. So now when you're having to live in a household filled with tension, you have to find peace in any way that you can. By God's grace and through his word, he draws you nearer to him each day. And if we follow his commands, we're able to do that. Now, there's something that's important as we get ready to retell the story of Hagar. There is a piece uh, written by Marina Hoffman, and it's called Hagar was a, well, basically, Hagar is a trauma victim. Now, according to Hoffman, she said Sarah was a trauma victim, Hagar was a trauma victim, Abraham was a trauma victim. But we are focusing on Hagar today. So when we look at these kinds of things, who experienced the kind of trauma that she did as an Egyptian servant whose life was basically held in the hands of Abraham and Sarah, basically more Sarah because, she is your slave, do with her as you wish. And that's a paraphrase. So um, we just know from the beginning that there's going to be a lot of strife. She's taken from her home from at the very beginning of our story, so she has to be resilient. She's placed in a situation where she has no social identity. She has no place. She has no family. She has no support system, which we've seen throughout chapter 16 of Genesis. So she has to live in this disruptive environment, and she is seen as a lowly outsider, far from home. So, and one who becomes part of God's family, uh, but not a physical family here. The disruption in Hagar's life could only move to her becoming this involuntary surrogate we mentioned earlier. When she discovers she's pregnant, she assumes her new identity is going to be something positive. But instead, guess what? It becomes something very negative. And in a case like this, she transitions from a victim, okay, in her attitude towards Sarah, to become a victimizer. Now Hagar reinforces Sarah's pain of infertility or barrenness by um, lording over Sarah the fact that she's infertile. Hagar is now bearing Abraham's offspring. So the hope for the future and the promise and the purpose, now I have this child, I have a modicum of safety. He has a chance to have a different type of life rather than being the son of a slave. Okay, none of that works really out for her. So, but in the midst of her crisis, she gets this visit from a divine messenger. And and when the divine messenger meets her, she now knows that she has a purpose, that she has a journey. And the beautiful thing is that she has arrived. So the her flight in characteristics from being one who has no faith to one who can withstand a trauma is almost complete. The trauma that Hagar suffers um, is one that is suffered every day in our lives. It does not mean that we are involuntary surrogates to someone, but it could be that we have things that we like and we're not getting it. Now, did Abraham suffer trauma? And I'll only make the one statement that yes, he did. He is characterized throughout Genesis 16 as passive, and he follows Sarah's initial directive as not the head of the household, saying, no, this is not good. Um, but he follows it. He goes ahead and he sleeps with the servant. And when there's conflict between the two, he leaves it for someone else to solve. He didn't intervene as he should have intervened. So, what can we learn from these lessons or from the trauma that Hagar withstood? We just know that we have a God who understands. But it's important that we understand the effects of trauma and that this God is going to allow us and He will reassure us so that we will be able to go. But if we have to retell this narrative of the Hagar, we have to think of the personal weaknesses, of the quick judgments that we make, of the lack of trust that we give to one another. And that's not mentioning saying, okay, God, I can handle it. You cannot handle it. It's not the kind of thing. One of the things that I liked about it was Hagar's wisdom came in not pretending that everything was all right. She allowed herself to feel the weight of the situation. Now, what are some of the legacies that we have here from Hagar as we come to this session's close? There are 15 lessons. God hears and He sees us, and we've talked about that before. We understand that He hears and He sees us. We understand that God provides. In Hagar's case, we know that God is faithful to the outcast. We've said that, and hopefully we pointed that out very clearly that He's very faithful. God never rejects us regardless of our situation. He never rejects us. God still works, even if we go against His plan. And I hate to say it, but in this case, it is Abraham who goes against the plan. But as we said earlier, he listened. He listened to someone that he shouldn't have listened to. So, but we get into this, and we're able to see, as is the psalmist said, "Blessed be God, because He has not rejected my prayer or removed His steadfast hand from me." There are beautiful psalms that reiterate that over and over, and they're throughout the book of Psalms. We're going to go through a few more of the things that we learned from Hagar, and they are important as we go through them. What God has done. He provides, He aids, He makes sure that we are strong as we stand, and we have all of that we need. Now, Mary York, who's taking a look at abuse of Hagar, see, to God who sees, a look at abuse in this narrative. She admits in the first line, the first paragraph, that she looked at the story of Hagar wrong. She saw Hagar as a very negative and unthankful concubine who should have, here is Sarah who was like all good, and here's Hagar who's just terribly wrong. Um, but after reading the story again, she understands now what that abuse was like, and having lived in a household of this type, the strife, the unpleasantness that goes on is very difficult. Whether you are a wife, a mother, mother goes with a wife or a concubine or a slave, these are all things that go on. And you're going to have to understand that and that God wants us to be all one family. Now, we have cultural norms that say you can't do that today, but you have to take a very close look at the contract that is given to women who are who become voluntary or technologically surrogates. So we can apply it today, the story of Hagar today, as one of the things that we have to do. And the first thing we have to do is that we have to recognize everyone is capable of inflicting great hurt. The second thing we have to do is that We have to remember that wounds do not go unnoticed by God. We can hide them here on earth, but God sees all of that. And if we want to just skip out of Genesis, we could go into Job 12:22, and it verifies that. And thirdly, we have to wait to see the fulfillment of God's promises. This again gets to this I can do it, or I only need it, or that's all right, God, I've got it. But if we want to take a look, again, we've talked about the sexual abuse, we've talked about the trauma. We want to take a look at some recent scholarship. Um, there is a book that's not really new, but it's called Reimagining Hagar, Blackness in the Bible, and it was published by Professor Niger Jr., who is at Temple University now. But she starts off by talking about the fact that when she taught at Howard, students would come up and tell her Hagar was black. So she decided to do the research and do the book. Now, there's an interview online that she did with I'm trying to remember the name of it. She did it with the Ancient Jewish Review, which is a publication um, that she did with the host for this, and they talk about why it's important that we look at Hagar in a different light. We can't see her as Auntie Hagar. We have to see her as the Hagar of today. We have to look at it. But she's not the only one who has done work. Um, we have Shakespeare, we have Chaucer, we have Daniel Defoe, we have the great writers, and we have many, many black writers, especially those of fiction, who've chosen Hagar as a character model for them to go through. So take some time and take a look at these people as we go. I would invite you to take more time and look at Hagar. I would invite you to say to yourself, these are the things that we have to do. Thank you for joining us today. If you have questions or comments, please let me know and we'll take them up and go into more of our discussion of Hagar and the blackness thereof and why it is important to remember her as black. Thank you. Thank you.